Welcome back, everyone. This is Carl Weiss at Fairway Independent Mortgage Corporation. My NMLS number is 263293. And today's financial literacy podcast, we're joined by Mr. Clayton Janson, a certified financial planner at Focus Financial. And of course, Clay, if people have direct questions for you, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
I think two ways, Carl. Thanks for asking. Email's always great. Clayton, Clayton, just like you see right there, and my name on the Zoom video at Focus Financial, and Focus is spelled Phocus, financial.com. That's the easiest way. I tend to have my laptop with me 7 days a week. My wife doesn't like that, but easy to get back in contact there, or give me a call 602-955-7705. Always good to chat on the phone, and we can definitely do Zoom calls. We can do phone calls, meet in person. We're really flexible. Love visiting with folks and meeting people where they're at and just connecting.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Well, so on today's podcast, we've covered a couple of segments on budgeting. And again, I know for a lot of people you might be rolling your eyes a little bit that we're starting at kind of very foundational levels, and that is on purpose. The thing about financial literacy is the stronger your foundation is, the higher you can go up in knowledge base. And when you see people online tout all kinds of information, um, a lot of times that's through experience, and occasionally it's misguided. And they have holes. I guess my background in finance started on the financial planning world, where Mr. Janson is, today. But for me, this is 30 years ago. And having that background on the financial planning world was really eye-opening, because it was a very objective and independent look at the financial world. And some of the education through that process, and certainly through the College of Financial Planning that I did, really opens your eyes to, not good or bad, but just what is it? How does it work? Nuts and bolts. And I wish everybody had that background. I wish that was
Yeah.
available in the K-12 system. I wish that a high school graduate understood what a budget was, how to make one, and had one working that they could pull out on their phone and say, here's where I'm at.
Yep.
I wish they could do a balance sheet and knew what it was, or a personal profit and loss statement, Um, and most of them would be in a loss category until they had a job. Because, I have kids, Mr. Jansen has kids, so but we've missed this fundamental education. And so that's why we're starting from scratch, because it's really important that people actually deeply understand, all of these concepts, because we're building a skyscraper, and we don't want to do it in soft sand knowledge-wise. We
Yep.
want you to really get a deep understanding. And so if you've got a deep understanding and you need to advance to the next series in the sequence, please do. Um, However, you have friends, family members, spouses, please have them start at scratch. It doesn't hurt. Then you'll have something to discuss, the next time you guys go out to dinner, or make dinner at home, depending on what your budget looks like, right? So we've talked about budgeting quite a bit, and some different strategies, both on paper and electronically. And so now we're going to move kind of to the next layer. And I think most people understand the retail banking world, right? Most of us have checking accounts and savings accounts and maybe a certificate of deposit. We used to say passbook savings, so those are pretty
Right.
passe at this point. Um, but once you graduate from that, and you want to say, hey, I'd like to expand past the retail bank experience of savings accounts and CDs, certificates of deposit, the world opens up a lot. And I don't want to be too generic, but I also think that people need some ground level ideas and concepts, so that our discussion, builds on, this complexity, and, people have a kind of a solid understanding of what we're talking about. So as we talk about these things and these other layers, which are called in the industry asset classes, um, Clay, can you kind of help us start at scratch and sort of build up from what is an asset class and what do we need to know about them?
Yeah, that's a great transition, Carl. So we're mentally leaving the banking world. We're mentally leaving some of those what I would call true savings tools, right? Savings, I think, is wildly different than investing, and we're kind of making that in this question here. We're kind of making that transition from
Mhm.
savings to investments. And when I think of asset classes, just kind of a high level definition, I think of these are investments that are going to behave similarly when you invest in them, right? In a group, they're going to have similar results in a lot of ways, and they're going to be regulated, right? Either by the IRS or other entities in a similar way, right? So it's kind of like a similar group,
Okay.
if you will, or a family group, right? These are investment types. Is so when you hear that word asset class, or you see it online, or maybe your employer's got you signed up for your 401k and you see that phrase, think of it as assets behaving similarly and typically being regulated in a similar fashion. So what are some of those asset classes that you might see? Again, we're going to take this from a really high level, Carl, and I appreciate that we're taking it slow. We're building a foundation, right, for folks watching your series. So I would normally say in my discussion with clients, I would put cash again back into savings, but you could consider cash as like the first asset class because whether you're buying right a CD at the bank or a money market fund at the bank or your savings and checking account, notice how all those things are behaving very similarly.
Right.
But really, once you leave savings and you go to investments, I think of three. I think of three key asset classes. Number one, I think most people instantaneously think of stocks. We call those in our industry equities, but really it's the ownership of a company, right, or fractional ownership of a company in the United States or internationally, right? But stocks would be the first one.
Yep.
Second one would be bonds, and we call those in our industry fixed income. And those bonds could be issued by the US government, right? Treasury bonds, they could be issued by a municipal government, state of Arizona, city of Phoenix, right? They could be issued by a corporation, right? So there are lots of different types of bonds, and that could be a really great discussion too as we go through some of these opportunities to educate folks. And then the third one I put is into a third category I like to call alternatives. And as the world goes on and evolves, there's going to be things in alternatives like currencies, right? Different currencies of different countries. There's going to be things like precious metals, right? A lot of folks invest in gold, gold coins, bullion, things like that, silver. There's going to be things like cryptocurrency, right? But again, these are typically higher risk things, right? Again, behaving differently than cash, stocks, and bonds, right? Again, that's what an asset class is, right? These things are behaving slightly differently. So those are the three top that I think of outside of cash: stocks, bonds, and alternatives.
Okay, so can you walk us through sort of how you approach the advice on the asset classes, both for the, sort of individual investments and somebody who's, you know, they have only a banking experience, right? They have a retail bank or credit union where they have quote savings accounts and they're tiptoeing into, let's call it the investment world.
Yep.
And how do you sort of approach the asset classes, in general with those folks?
Yep. Great question. So first of all, anybody watching this video, we want to approach investing the way it means to you, yourself, your family, your personal situation. So I
Right.
say that, I start with that because a lot of times in our worlds, right, somebody says, "Oh, I talked to my neighbor. I talked to somebody at work," right? And sometimes their situation and their needs with investing are nowhere close to what your situation is. So we always want to start with, right, the client that we're speaking with face to face live. And really, it boils down for that client, I think, two key things. What is your comfort with risk? Because once we start talking about assets outside of the banking space, pretty typically, we're talking about what is this investment going to do? Everybody wants it to make money, trust me. But a lot of these, right, these investment asset classes have a risk element or a potential for loss. When we say risk, the word risk itself means there's two outcomes that are possible. Risk can be make money and make gains, but risk could also mean loss, right? So we always want to make that clear. what is your comfort zone for risk? We actually have a questionnaire that we give clients because we want to know inside your brain. It's so easy to somebody says, "Oh, I want to make money, Clay, with no possibility of loss." Well, that's not the situation where risk, right? That might be more of a banking product in the savings world. That's not going to be an investment, right, for the long term, or at
Correct.
least not the situation you think is going to occur. The second thing beyond risk is your time horizon. That's a fancy way of saying, when does this investment plan to get used?
Okay.
And once you have these two components, comfort for risk and time horizon, right? Comfort for risk, Clay, I really don't want to see this investment going up and down and sideways with the balance. I need something a little bit, right? A little bit more standardized every month, making a little bit of gains, right? And I'm willing to give up the bigger returns. Okay, so we'll get a comfort zone for your risk. And Clay, I need this fund to be available to do this task. It's got to be there to fund my college education for my kids. It's got to be there for the house I want to buy in 6 months with Carl, right? I'm working on a down payment. It's got to be there for my retirement. Once we find these two things, it almost perfectly then allows us to help identify what's the right asset class or what's the right combination. So, a great example, you might not be retiring for 40 years, right? You're just out of right college. Maybe you've got that first career job. You're working up right the corporate ladder, and you've got 40, maybe even in some cases 50 years, right, to go. A lot of my clients will say, Clay, I'm comfortable with more risk in that situation because I've got such a long time horizon. I'm willing to extend out and maybe use some things like stocks or some of those alternatives that you had chatted about, right? So if you're buying a house in 6 months, maybe it's not investing at all. Maybe it's kind of looking back at that cash or that banking knowledge that you have.
Right.
Because funny enough, Carl, I'm sure you get this too. I get it pretty often, even today, right? Where people say, Clay, I'm short on a down payment I need to make. I need something really risky so I can get ready to make this down payment.
Mm.
And I
Yep.
warn people that is a recipe for disaster, right?
Yep.
Because what happens with investments again, in many cases, again, risk, we just defined risk, it could go up or down, is that when people invest money in a risky investment in hopes that they're going to make short-term returns, something can happen. A war breaks out in the Middle East, right? Something happens with commercial real estate. I mean, we all probably think back to COVID happened, right?
Right.
And so things tend to happen, and it's not necessarily happening on the timeline you want it to. So the shorter the timeline, I guess the point I'm trying to make is the lower the risk we should have. The longer the timeline, please use that to your advantage, right? Because the markets in asset classes tend to be volatile in some cases, but we need that longer term time horizon to help even out some of those gains.
Cool. I love that. And maybe let's take one quick step back that of something that maybe I glossed over that I think might be useful for people is, okay, if we're, if we're used to the banking environment, the checking and the savings accounts, right? These are things that we do, whether it's a bank or credit union, any financial institution. When should someone say, like, at what point do you think a good time is for someone to say, should I investigate the investment world?
Oh, I love that question. That's a good step back. My big, huge recommendation, I would really love for somebody to have a super strong savings account, super strong, right? Opportunity to defend against emergencies, right? So I always think of that as a short term bucket, right? So I really
Yep.
want clients to have a very strong emergency bucket. The rule of thumb there is having 6 months of your budget, right? So in our first two segments that we recorded, Carl, we were talking a lot about savings and budgets. And I would really want somebody to have that 6 to 9 month budget, ideally. Now, we could do double dipping here as well, because we mentioned that on our prior video,
Right.
right? We could save for long term and we could save for investing, but we want to be actively well on our way on the emergency fund, right? On the savings. We don't want to skip that, because the second you skip the emergency fund or that savings piece, trust me, Murphy's Law happens, right? If it
Absolutely.
yeah, if it can happen, it will happen. And you will have that true emergency. And then something is either stuck in an account, right? Like a retirement account, a 401k, and it's got possible penalties, or you can't even get at it at all, right?
Right.
And then you're in a situation where you're racking up credit card debt again, and it can be dangerous. So I really do want people to have a super strong savings, or at least be actively, strongly building that.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. And thanks for kind of stepping back because I think I may have
Yeah, good call.
jumped
Yep.
that point a little bit. But you know, and I guess from my perspective too, it's never too early to start to have the conversation.
Right.
If you work with a financial professional like Clay, what you'll find out is that is a recommendation of somebody who's a true professional versus there are a lot of people out there that aren't as independent, that aren't as well educated, that might push you to a product when you don't have that established savings. So, again, you've got to work with the right professional, but make sure that it doesn't hurt if you're, 18 with your first job to start having these conversations
Yep.
because it's never too early to start investing or saving. And
That's-
y- at every different stage of life, you may have a different requirement for how much savings you truly need before you start investing. But again, like the double dipping scenario, if that's not your challenge, you can double dip in the investment and the savings world together
Oh,
too.
absolutely. Definitely do that.
And that's not
Um,
uncommon. And we see young professionals do that all the time, right? They
yep.
start a new job, they've never made this much money. Um, Now they're investing in both a 401k and they have extra funds left over for, and of course in my world, I like to think of money in terms of buckets, right? Like
Oh, I love that.
I love the
Love buckets.
analogy of
Buckets
bucket
of money. The
buckets of
bigger, the
money.
better.
And, we
Yeah.
got some short-term expense buckets, we got a medium-term expense bucket, and we've got these long-term expense buckets. The long-term would be more of your retirement assets and your 401k and 403b, uh, you know, set plans,
I
stuff like
think of
that.
them, yeah, I think of them the same way, Carl. And I think that again, back to human psychology, subconsciousness, right? We talked about that on our prior segments. It's a bucket of money. I mean, you can just picture that in your mind,
Yep.
right? And I actually change the order of those in terms of priority. Sometimes people think exactly what you just said, which is totally normal: short term, midterm, long term. It's kind of more of a chronological ordering. I actually changed those slightly in terms of where I think people should naturally think about them, almost in a priority, right? So
Oh,
short
okay.
term, yeah, short term first, because again, emergencies happen. They happen suddenly. You have to be prepared for them. So even if you're double dipping into multiple buckets, you want to make sure that you've got that solved, right, at some point. And everybody, as you mentioned, has a different comfort zone, different budget. So it might be a different number, right, for just about anybody.
Sure.
But the rule of thumb there, right? 6 months. I'm more of a 6 to 9 months. If you're a business owner, you might be a 9 to 12 months, right? Because you've got a
Yep.
lot of overhead and things like that to pay. But really, once you get that really strong savings bucket, I actually do counsel clients really start focusing long term. So I actually tell folks start planning that long term bucket because that's again psychologically where you're going to say, hey, I am saving investment dollars. I am investing these dollars for my future retirement, for my future self, to replicate my future budget, right? And there is something wildly powerful about that. And again, I'm so thankful that our industry has made this process automated. It's often deducted right from your paycheck, right? And if you need to, you can, if you don't have something at a local employer, you can definitely do something on your own, as we mentioned in a prior segment, where you're just telling your bank, hey, I just want to send money right over to this bucket. IRA, Roth IRA, 401k. Carl mentioned a 403b. Now, some of those might sound like a little buzz phrases. Some of these are codes in the IRS of right authorizing retirement funds, but it's longer term. And
Yep.
then the third bucket, actually, let me go back to the retirement bucket. That bucket, inevitably, you're going to want to start thinking about saving 15 to 20% of your pay into that long-term bucket. And that's why it's so, I think, onerous to people is they're like, Clay, I can't afford 20%. I hear you. I know I have to do that, but man, I just can't afford that right now. I did your 12-month budget. I did those first two videos that you and Carl recommended, but I just can't do that. So I'm not saying go cold turkey onto 15 or 20. Start small. Start 5%. Start 7%, right? Your employer might be giving you a match and helping out, right? So I am not saying you have to start cold turkey at 20, but inevitably that's going to be the magic number. Again, we've been doing this 47 years at the firm. I've been doing it 21 here. I'm a second generation financial planner. So we have clients that are in their 90s that are with us that started in their 40s. So I will tell you, our most successful clients, bar none, are folks that started small, increase that number into that retirement bucket, that long-term bucket over time, right? As you get a raise, you start to say, hey, I got a 5% raise. I'm going to put, right, I'm going to put another 1 or 2% into my retirement fund, right? And increase that investment. And then
Absolutely. And
really,
we
yeah,
find that to be huge. And you and I both know that the power of the compounding is over time.
yeah,
So that, there's a famous slide, when I started in the industry, 35 years ago, that was the power of 1%.
yeah,
And, 1%, like, what does that matter? And the answer is, it depends what your time horizon is, how many years, but 1% a year over 40 years is a significant change.
yeah,
And to your point, I love that you're right. The short term, life's going to happen, right? We're going to have some emergency expenses that come up. Um, but then to plan for the future and really dig in that one hard, I love that, because that's sort of one of the first budget line items once you've completed the budget that we've talked about in the first two videos is, what are these fixed expenses? And, past mortgage or rent, and, car payment and student loans and things of that nature, retirement planning is right there.
agreed,
And that bucket is very important to start filling at an early age so that it grows to be massively huge.
agreed. And
And
what
so, okay, so
really
then the third bucket must be
the
the
bucket,
intermediate size.
yeah, I call it the mid bucket, midterm bucket. So if you think about it in timelines, and I get a lot of clients that ask questions, I think the short term bucket, again, emergency bucket, I think of that as like 0 to 2 years. Anything you're going to be doing in 0 to 2 years, emergencies is a zero, right? That's the zero
Yep.
year. But if you're buying a house, if you're buying, right, you're buying something special for Christmas for somebody, right? That's the 0 to 2 year bucket. Got to have it ready to go. Your retirement bucket is typically, for most of my clients, 10 or more years down the road.
Okay.
20, 30, 40 isn't uncommon, right? For my
Sure.
younger investors. Yeah. So
Sure.
that mid bucket, if you just kind of caught those timelines, is somewhere between 2 and 10,
Okay.
right? 0 to 2 on the emergency short term bucket, 10 and greater on the retirement bucket. That 2 to 10 year bucket, it's so elusive for people. I will have people come in who are very successful savers. They've got an emergency fund. They're very successful retirement savers, investors. They've got 20% of their paycheck going in. And they come in and they say, Clay, I'm done. I got it all figured out. And I'm like, where's the midterm bucket? And they're like, what are you talking about? I said, well, you got done telling me that you're going to have to buy a car in the next 4 or 5 years, right? Where's that money coming from? And they're like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I think every time that it comes to buying my car. I've always wanted to pay for a car for cash.
Hmm.
And I'm like, but you got to have a bucket for that. You got to have
Right.
something that you're putting away that's specifically for those things that don't happen, that aren't necessarily for your retirement and aren't necessarily the short term emergencies. It's all of those other things, right? It could be a roof replacement, it could be a new car. It's all those things that I wouldn't necessarily call an emergency, but I definitely wouldn't call necessarily retirement expenses either long term, right? So I think this is the most misunderstood bucket. It doesn't get enough attention,
Yep.
um, but it's not going to be in an IRA.
The
It's
Rodney Dangerfield of buckets.
That's right. Yeah, no respect, no respect,
No respect for the
no
mid
respect.
third bucket.
So that's the magic bucket for a lot of people that have kind of got some traction. So if you're watching this video and you're thinking, man, I thought this was going to be more of the basics. This is that next step. If you've already nipped the savings account and you're saving 15 to 20% in your retirement account, my question to you is, do you have that midterm bucket, right? And then really after that, after you kind of have this mental picture, it's really how much risk is in each of those buckets. The savings short-term bucket, low to no risk, right? Because you need that money to be there. The
Hmm.
long-term bucket, higher risk. And guess what? That midterm bucket may be somewhere in between, right? Where you can deal with a little bit of turbulence. Another real quick rule of thumb, pro tip, play how much risk should I have? I think the old right rule of thumb is you take the number 100, 100, you subtract your age, and that should be a beginning discussion on how comfortable you should be putting some of that money at risk. So my son happens to be 10 years old. I take 100, I minus his age, 10 years old, I get the number 90, right? He should be conceptually comfortable with 90% or more of that money at risk, right? Because he has such a long timeline
Correct.
My grandmother, before she passed, she was 98. 100 minus 98 is 2. She basically didn't need anything at risk, right? Again, it's kind of a function of age and time and just getting an understanding of where that number should be as a percentage. How much risk should you at least be considering or thinking about? Even though psychologically you might be like, Clay, I'm nervous. It's time, as Carl mentioned. How much time do you have? And you got to use that to your advantage.
Yeah, I love that. And this will be a great place for us to wrap up this segment. Stick with us on the next one when we continue with discussions on asset classes. And we're going to go a little bit deeper on those and give some pointers. So we will see you on the next video.